Thank you, Emily. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. If you've been paying close attention to our series, this is the third in a total of 6 series. And today we're going to specifically be talking about the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant Program. We've got quite a bit of content to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. So just wanted to go through a brief timeline of the Shuttered Venue Operator Grant Program. It was established as part of the Economic Aid Act, which was signed into law back in December of last year. The Economic Aid Act authorized $15 billion to the SVOG program. In early March, now it's April, hard to believe it's already April, March 11th of this year, the American Rescue Plan Act was signed into law, and that added an additional $1.2 billion to the program. So right now there's $16.2 billion in total allocated to SVOG. Big news is that the SBA SVOG, lots of acronyms, SBA SVOG portal opens April 8th, which is 1 week from today. So it's very important that you have all of the information you need to make sure that you can jump on this program when the portal opens next week. The first 14 days of grants will be awarded to entities that suffered the most significant loss, so 90% or greater revenue loss between April and December of last year. The following 14 days of grants will be awarded to the second priority group, which is entities that suffered a 70% or greater revenue loss between April and December of last year. And then after those first 2 priority groups, after that first 28 days, the third priority group will be opened up, and it will be for entities that suffered a 25% or greater earned revenue loss between one quarter in 2019 and that same corresponding quarter in 2020. You'll notice on this slide that I did bold and underline a couple of key terms that we're going to talk about later in the presentation. We're going to talk about the difference in definition between revenue and earned revenue, because those are going to be really important things to take into consideration when you're pulling your documents together to get ready for applying for the program. So eligibility requirements, what makes you eligible? First off, you had to be in operation on February 29th of last year. So if you are a new, if you're a new organization that opened up after February 29th of 2020, you are not eligible for this grant program. You also had to have a reduction in gross earned revenue by at least 25%. So that's kind of going back to the last slide. That third priority group is kind of the minimum eligibility requirement for receiving any funding through this program. You have to be a live venue operator or promoter, a theatrical producer, live performing arts organization operator, a motion picture theater operator, museum operator, or a talent representative. You have to be currently open right now or have plans to reopen, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. And you have to have a defined space where the performances or movies are held. If you have reviewed the frequently asked questions posted on the SBA's website, you'll see a few references to having a set of seats that are in a certain place that can't be moved. Obviously, this eligibility requirement excludes the talent reps. They obviously don't need to have a defined space, but there are other eligibility requirements that those talent representatives have to fall under. But defined space is going to be one of those major ones for all other categories. So a few things that would make you ineligible for receiving this grant: if you are not located in the United States, if you were not in operation as of February 29th of last year, if you're publicly traded or if you're owned by a publicly traded organization, you are not eligible. If you have more than 10% of your 2019 gross earned revenue coming from the federal government, you are not eligible for SVOG. If you own or operate venues in more than one country, or if you own or operate venues in more than 10 states and you have more than 500 employees as of February 29th of last year. If you're in more than 10 states, but you have less than 500 employees total, you may be eligible, and vice versa. If If you own or operate in less than 10 states, but have more than 500 employees, there is potential that you could be eligible for this program. So that last item is an and statement. So you have to meet both of those to be ineligible. So a little bit of detail about the award. The maximum grant award that your organization can receive is $10 million. The award will be based on a percentage of your 2019 gross earned revenue. So the potential is that you may qualify for a grant up to 45% of your 2019 gross earned revenue. So this could be a very substantial amount of money depending on the size of your organization. You have 1 year from the date of the award to use the funds. If you are awarded supplemental funding, if it's available, you have an additional 6 months, but for the initial award, you have 1 year from the date you receive the award to use all of the funds. If you don't use all of the funds in that 1 year period, you will be required to pay the unused funds back. PPP loans we'll talk a little more about later in the presentation. But just want to be sure that everybody understands that any PPP loans received after December 27th of 2020 will reduce the amount of your total grant awarded by the amount of your PPP loan. So again, we'll dive into a little more detail about those two programs and how they interact later. So I mentioned before that revenue types were going to be an important item to be aware of. So we have gross revenue and gross earned revenue. These two have different definitions, and this will play a big role in how your information is calculated. So gross revenue is all revenue in whatever form from whatever source. So this, if you are a nonprofit organization, this may include contributions, donations, and grants, excluding any money that you've received from disaster assistance. This also includes restricted revenue. So if you've received a large restricted grant, that is included. Gross revenue is all revenue in whatever form from whatever source. So any money that has come in, that's going towards your gross revenue totals. Gross revenue will be used to identify first and second priority groups. So again, that's if you saw a 90% or more reduction in your gross revenue or a 70% or more reduction in your gross revenue, you will fall into priority groups 1 or 2. If you don't meet either of those tests, they'll look at your gross earned revenue. And that gross earned revenue means revenue received from the sales of goods or services. So this excludes donations, sponsorships, government assistance, return on investments. This is essentially revenue that you have actually earned from the sale of a good or service. So any restricted donations, any restricted grants you've received, none of that is included in gross earned revenue. So again, if you don't meet the qualifications to fall into the first or second priority group, they'll look at your gross earned revenue to identify if you meet the requirements to fall into the third priority group. And that third priority group, again, as a reminder, was a reduction of 25% reduction in gross earned revenue between calendar quarter 2020 and that same calendar quarter in 2019. So it's important to know the difference when you're looking at your numbers and trying to plan ahead for which priority group you may fall into. You'll need to know this information so that you can plan. So how do you go about applying? The best thing that you can be doing right now is reviewing the SBA.gov portal splash page prior to the start date, which again is next week. You also need to make sure that you register for a DUNS number if you don't already have one at dnb.com. You can also go to dnb.com and check to see if you already have a DUNS number. So registering for a DUNS number is free. You won't be charged to register for that number, but you'll need that DUNS number to be able to register to receive a federal grant award at sam.gov. If you haven't done this before, the SBA.gov website has a great video tutorial walking you through the registration process. It is also fairly straightforward on the website. I haven't done it myself, but I did walk through the video tutorial and it is pretty straightforward, but you do need that DUNS number prior to the registration. Some of these registrations can take 7 to 14 days, potentially longer. So you want to make sure, if you haven't done this yet, do this today. Get both of these things done today if you can. You'll also want to review the eligibility requirements and the preliminary application checklist at sba.gov. I'll reference that sba.gov website quite a few times. It is an absolutely wonderful resource. I'm on that page every single day, helping answer questions. Make sure, if you haven't gone to the SBA's website specifically for the SVOG program, make sure you go to that today, review everything that's on it. There's a set of frequently asked questions. There are the 2 checklists that I just referenced, and there are a number of video tutorials that you can go back and watch to get yourself ready for the program. When you're looking at the preliminary application checklist, you'll want to start working on compiling the necessary documents. I kind of vacillated back and forth between adding a slide that included all the documents you need. However, if you look at the preliminary application checklist, it is 5 pages long. There are a lot of documents that you will need to compile to get ready for this program. So as opposed to me listing those off, that preliminary application checklist is out there, and you'll need to go through and review it and make sure that you have everything you need. Some of the documents required are specific to the type of venue or organization that you are, but there are things such as maps and pictures of your venue. So they'll need you basically need to prove that you are a qualifying venue. You'll need organizational documents, financial documents, background documents. Basically, you name it, you'll need it. So you'll want to make sure that you go through that preliminary application checklist and compile everything so that you are ready to go on April 8th. So you want to be prepared to submit your application right away. The applications will be reviewed on a first come, first served basis, and the SBA will be putting them into the correct priority bucket based on information provided. So if you have taken a look at your financials, and let's say you've determined that you will likely fall into priority bucket number 3. So you're going to have to wait about 28 days before you may receive a grant award. Still plan, if you can, to submit your application on April 8th. They're going to review it, and they're going to put you in line in that 3rd priority based on when you submit your application. So it's really important that you're prepared before next week, or as close to April 8th as possible, so that you can get your application in right away. Again, going to the sba.gov website is going to be a really great resource for you to find all of the information that you need. So many organizations that are looking to receive this money may not be familiar with the federal award process. Registering at sam.gov, applying for a federal award is a little bit different than some of the loans and grant funding that has been available from the prior stimulus packages. So I wanted to make sure that everybody kind of understood what some of the differences are. So if your organization is deemed to be eligible and you've been put into a specific priority group, you will receive a proposed award amount. Now, the SBA is not beholden to this amount. It'll be based on a few follow-up conversations and questions and potential document requests once they've approved you for the award, but you will receive a proposed award amount once you've been deemed eligible. As an applicant, you can accept up to the proposed award amount. So if you don't want, let's say your organization has a proposed award amount of $1 million, but you just don't feel that you'll be able to spend that $1 million before the end of the year or before the end of your 1-year period. You can choose to spend, you can choose to request $500,000 instead. And then you're going to create a proposed budget based on that proposed award amount that you'd like to accept. One thing to keep in mind is that if you expend more than $750,000 in federal award money in your fiscal year, you will be subject to a single audit. And that's if your organization already receives an audit, a single audit is additional work that needs to be done on top of a regular audit. So it is not the same as just having a regular financial statement audit. There are additional things that need to be done by your organization and your auditor. So just make sure you're thinking about that as well. Make sure that you're prepared if you do accept $750,000 or more and intend to spend all of that money in one fiscal year, or if you've received other federal awards, all of that combines together. And so you need to be thinking about those things. Once you create your proposed budget based on that proposed award amount, you must also provide an estimated date of reopening. So again, one of the qualifications for being eligible is that you're either currently open or you intend to reopen. And part of that is if you aren't open right now but intend to reopen, you have to have an estimated date of reopening. That is part of the application process, that is part of the reporting process. So when you receive a federal award, you are required to report on the expenditures on Form SF-425, which is a federal financial report. So again, if you haven't received a federal award in the past, this would all be new things that you would need to get yourself comfortable with and be familiar with. The budget that you create, it's not just put some numbers in some buckets. You have to adhere to that budget. That's very important. There's going to be somebody that is auditing that Form SF-425. They're going to be making sure that you are sticking to the budget that you created as part of that proposal process. Per the SBA, it is typically okay to move 10%, up to 10% of funds between expenditure buckets without prior approval, and they intend to adhere to that. However, you want to be careful if you're making sure that you're staying under 10% or under, because if you do move too many buckets around, you may be subject to additional audit requirements by the SBA, by the federal government, and Melody may be able to speak to that a little bit more as an auditor, what the requirements are when you're receiving a federal award. You also may receive one lump sum disbursement if you are awarded this money, or you may receive up to 3 to 4 disbursements. It's going to depend on the level of assessed risk. They have 3 categories of risk: low, medium, and high risk. It will be based on the information that you provide to the SBA when you're applying for funds. They didn't have specific details about how you would end up in the low, medium, or high risk categories. If you're in a low risk, you would receive 1 lump sum. If you're in the medium risk or moderate risk, you may receive 2 to 3 disbursements. And if you're in the high risk, you may receive 3 to 4 disbursements. What happens if you receive more than 1 disbursement is that you'll be required to submit additional form or interim Form SF-425s to report on the money that you've spent since you received the first disbursement. So just know that there is the potential that you may not receive all of this money at once. You may receive it in installments. So how can you use the funds? It's pretty open-ended for the use of funds, and we have very specific not allowed use of funds as well. So allowable use of funds are things like payroll, rent, utilities, other ordinary and necessary business expenses. You can use it to make payments to independent contractors. However, you can only pay them up to $100,000 on an annualized basis. So there are some caps in place for how you can use the funds. Ordinary and necessary business expenses will also include things like maintenance costs. Some of the other categories include marketing, insurance, administrative costs. So there really are a fairly substantial use of funds. Another item that's in the frequently asked questions on the SBA's website, if you had ticket sales and you need to refund customers for those ticket sales for canceled events, you can use these funds to refund customers. Very specific items are not allowed. Things like purchasing real estate, debt payments on loans received after February 15th of last year. You can't use the funds to make any prepayments on mortgage or debt. You can't use the funds to make investments or loans to other parties, and you can't make any contributions to political parties with the funds. So you really need to be making sure that you are isolating these funds. I would recommend potentially putting these in a separate bank account and using these funds for very specific purposes. Another item to be thinking about is the use of funds if you've received other funds. We've talked quite a bit about that double dipping. So you have to be pretty careful that you aren't using these funds if you have funds that are already covering some of these expenses. So it's really important. Tracking is going to be vital here, especially considering how large some of these awards could potentially be. You're going to want to make sure that you're very, very diligent about tracking and holding on to your records. So some important notes that I want to make sure everybody is comfortable with. The final SF 425, again, that's that federal financial report, is due 15 days after expending all of your funds. So if you were not receiving the grant award in multiple disbursements, you may only have to file one final SF 425. And it's important to know that it's due 15 days after expending all of your funds. So you want to make sure that you stay in compliance. Again, this is a federal grant award. So there are a number of additional compliance pieces that you need to be aware of that you may not have experienced before if you haven't received federal award money. They recommend that you retain all of your employment records for 4 years and all other documents for 3 years. So payroll reports, tax forms, related payroll tax forms, those should all be kept for 4 years, and everything else needs to be kept on file for 3 years. Again, a reminder about that single audit requirement. If you expend more than $750,000 in your fiscal year, you are subject to a single audit requirements. This is not just for SVOG. If you've received other federal grant awards, those totals are combined, and that will subject you to a single audit. Now, if you are, for example, maybe you are a June 30th year end, so your calendar or your fiscal year goes from July 1st to June 30th, and you receive this grant right away in April. That means you have about 2.5, 3 months to use the money that you receive in your current fiscal year, and the rest would be used in your next fiscal year. If it crosses fiscal years, that may help you out a little bit if you do get a larger award, because some of that may be split over 2 of your fiscal years. And if you don't receive any other federal awards, it may help you stay under that $750,000 threshold. If you're in a calendar year and you receive $1 million, it's possibly likely that you're going to end up spending that at least $750,000 of it in this year. And so those single audit requirements kick in. So just make sure that you're planning for that. Again, there are additional requirements needed from your side and from your auditor's side if a single audit does apply to you. There is the potential for supplemental funding. It will be available if there is money left over in the program. If the money runs out, then they may issue $0 holds in place for the potential for more funding to be added to the program. If more funding is added to the program and you have applied for supplemental funding, you will be, again, it'll be a priority group. They'll kind of a first come, first serve basis, depending on where you fell in the first 3 priority groups. So just know that there may be supplemental funding available. However, it depends on how quickly this money runs out and or if they add more money to the program. So finally, just a few reminders about SVOG and PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program. SVOG does have some cross eligibility requirements with some of the other programs, but PPP has kind of been at the forefront about how it will interact with this grant program. So just a reminder that if you received a PPP loan in 2020, that has no impact on your eligibility or the amount of your SVOG potential award this year. So that means you received a PPP loan sometime between April of last year and the beginning of August when the PPP loan was in its initial run. Those will have no impact on your potential award. If you received a PPP loan this year, President Biden just signed the PPP Extension Act, I believe on today is Thursday, on Tuesday, which extended the PPP loan program application portal through the end of May. So if you had applied for and received a PPP loan this year, again, that will reduce the amount of your SVOG award by the amount of your PPP loan. So for example, if you received a $100,000 PPP loan this year, and you have a maximum SVOG of $450,000, the amount that you actually receive from SVOG will be $350,000. So keep that in mind. If you have been holding off on applying for PPP because maybe you were waiting for SVOG or you weren't sure if you needed that PPP funding, just know that once you start the application process for SVOG, you are no longer eligible to apply for a PPP loan. So once you get that SVOG, PPP is off the table. You may be denied an SVOG or put on hold. If you're put on hold, there is a do not pay list as it relates to federal grant awards. You will have 30 days to clear your name off that list. If you don't clear your name off that list, then you will be denied an SVOG award. If that is the case, you can go back and apply for a PPP loan. However, if you have started the SVOG process and it appears that you are pending approval, again, you cannot apply for a PPP loan once you've started that process. With that, I think we are just about out of time. Links to some resources, please keep an eye on our Wegner CPA's COVID-19 resource center. We try to post blogs and content as information comes out. And again, I've included a link to that SBA Shuttered Venue Operator Grant website. They've got a lot of great information, links to video tutorials. Make sure that you're going to that website and checking the preliminary application checklist. It's going to take you a little bit of time to gather all of the documents needed. So just make sure that you're starting that sooner rather than later. And again, that DUNS number and the SAM.gov registration are incredibly, incredibly important. You won't be able to apply for this grant without finishing those pieces.
Great, Kate. This is not my area of expertise. So while I tried to answer some of the questions as we went along, there aren't a lot. So I'd love to run them past you if that's Absolutely. Okay and take our time with that.
Definitely.
First, there's a question. We are a nonprofit that has a festival for 2 days each year, always on the same weekend. We could not have our event in 2020. Are we eligible?
The likelihood would be no. You do have to have a defined space. And I believe if you look through the frequently asked questions, it needs to be some sort of nominal part of your business. So if the nominal part of your organization is not hosting a festival or hosting events, then the likelihood is that you won't be eligible. Again, think about that defined space. Do you have an auditorium that you're operating? Do you have a venue that you're operating? If not, you likely won't be eligible for this grant.
Great. What is included in the definition of disaster assistance? Does that include some of the Wisconsin funds that were granted for cultural events?
Likely, yes. Most of that state and local assistance is something that has come from the stimulus bills. So the disaster assistance would be typically related to anything you've received from the COVID pandemic. And a lot of that state money was allocated to the states through the one of the 3 stimulus packages that have come out in this last year. So if it was a grant or a loan received due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the likelihood is that that is not going to be included. That would be excluded when looking at gross revenue or gross earned revenue.
Great. What about a live performing arts organization, including a symphony orchestra that doesn't have its own art center, but performs in others?
That's possible. So if you read through the frequently asked questions, they have updated it substantially over the last month. It was sort of a humorous document to read at first because most of the questions were answered with things like it is likely or it is possible. So I do think that there are still areas of interpretation. If you read through those frequently asked questions, you'll notice that quite a bit of the content, again, falls back to that defined space and seating secured in place somewhere. However, there are some possibilities that like I think one of the questions is a traveling circus eligible? And it says it is likely or it is possible. Again, if they have a defined space, if they don't have a defined space, but you are playing in other defined spaces, I think there is potential that you may be eligible. Again, I would highly recommend going through that frequently asked questions document. It is broken out pretty well based on the type of organization that you may be, and it will have a lot of really great detailed answers to some of those questions.
Yeah, and what my portion that I added was just the basic definition. It says eligible live events through ticketing, but it says is operating or using venues. So it didn't imply that you had to own.
Yes.
Okay. Portal. Do you have any concerns or any insights into how the portal is going to handle the onslaught on the 8th?
That is a great question. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some downtime on the first day or two. $16.2 billion sounds like a lot of money. But when you think about all of the venues and movie theaters and other type museums, other organizations that would fall into these categories, my personal opinion is that $16.2 billion is probably going to go pretty quickly. So if you can be ready to go on April 8th and sit on that website all day and work to get your application in, that would be my recommendation. Hopefully, the SBA has taken quite a bit of time. The SVOG was put in place by the Economic Aid Act, which was December 27th of 2020. That means they've spent a little over 3 months getting ready for this program. Obviously, there were a lot of guidance and compliance pieces that they needed to put together, but they also needed to have a portal that was going to be capable of withstanding the amount of traffic that we know will be there, especially on April 8th. So hopefully they've thought about that, but I would anticipate that there would be potential for downtime. When I think about the Economic Injury Disaster Loan and Grant Advance Program that existed before COVID, but really ramped up and was available basically to everybody, every organization in the country starting last year. They actually ended up going through a number of different iterations of the portal itself when applying for the EIDL loan and the EIDL grant. I think it went through 3 changes, so it was very different upon rollout versus what it became after the first and second iteration. So I would also, anticipate potential for updates. But again, if you can be ready to go next Thursday and just, hopefully it'll be totally smooth, but just be patient, but also be persistent and work to get, all that information compiled and in as soon as you can on April 8th or, the day or two after.
The other question is one that I sent you that came in by email in advance, but I will reiterate it. If they meet the requirements, but it looks like 45% of their 2019 earned revenue is less than their PPP second draw. Is there any reason to still apply?
Probably not, because the grant is just going to be reduced to 0. It may be worth it just to make sure that you've done the calculations correctly. However, like I mentioned, there is a lot of documentation that you have to compile. So if you feel very, very confident that that 45% of revenue number from 2019 is going to be less than your PPP loan, it is probably not worth putting in the time and energy. Because like I said, that preliminary application checklist is very extensive. It's 5 pages long. Again, it's not applicable. Everything on the list is not applicable to every organization that will apply. But there is a lot of gathering of documents that you'll need to do. I mean, you'll need to set aside a few hours to pull everything together. So might not be.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, because she was a little hesitant, and I know she's already working on a couple of the other options under
Sure.
the different relief. So that is very helpful.
Absolutely.
That is all the questions I have. You've done a great job helping us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, guys. Emily, I think we'll probably turn it back over to you to close us out.
That sounds great. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Just keep an eye out for a follow-up email from today, and you will have the recording of today's webinar. We also have 3 more webinars next week, mini webinars like today. So just go onto our website and check to make sure if any of those match any needs that you have. But other than that, Kate and Melody, thank you so much for all of your expertise today and all of the wonderful information. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.